According to the Christian writer Frederick Buechner, the gospel is not just good news. The gospel isn't just an announcement that God loves us and everything's going to be okay. Because the gospel tells the truth. And the truth is not everything is okay. And that many times our lives seem far more like a tragedy than some upbeat, happy-go-lucky comedy. And because of that, because the gospel tells us the truth, Buechner says, it's not just good news. The gospel, as he puts it, is bad news before it is good news. It is the news that man is a sinner, to use the old word, that he is evil in the imagination of his heart, that when he looks in the mirror, what he sees is at least 8 parts chicken, phony, slob. That is the tragedy. Of course, that's not all it is. If that were the only message of the Bible, that we're all a bunch of phony, hypocritical sinners, then we'd have very little reason to be joyful. But we do. Because, as Buechner goes on to say, because the gospel is also the news that we are loved anyway, cherished, forgiven, bleeding to be sure, but also bled for. That is the comedy. The gospel that we hear from Jesus begins with the bad news that we're sinners. We are those who are weary and heavy laden, Jesus says. He describes us as lost sheep that he's come to rescue, as sick people that are in need of healing. That's the tragedy. But Jesus also tells us good news, that he's come to heal us, that he wants to find us in our lostness and bring us home, that he wants to remove our burdens and bring rest to our souls. That's the good news. And it's also why the gospel requires faith, because it means that we have to believe. We have to trust that what Jesus tells us is actually true. That's the Christian gospel. And as it turns out, that's not too different from the gospel that was given to the people of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy. Their gospel also begins with bad news, and then moves on to good news, and then asks them to have faith, to trust that what God is telling them is true. You could see this in the final chapters of Deuteronomy. First, Israel's gospel begins with bad news. You could say that Deuteronomy is filled with bad news. In fact, it seems to be bad news right from the very beginning. In the very first chapter, Moses reminds the Israelites of how they failed to heed God's words and they refused to trust him and enter the land when he told them to. You would not go up, Moses tells them, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. And you murmured in your tents and said, because the Lord hated us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to give us into the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us. Hard to get much worse than that, but it does. Because now, having come to the very end of Deuteronomy, after Moses has talked about the blessings and curses and about God's faithfulness to his people, then God speaks to Moses and he tells him that Moses will die soon, and then he begins to talk about what the Israelites will do after Moses is gone. Then this people will rise and whore after the foreign gods among them in the land that they are entering, and they will forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them. It's one thing to look at yourself in a mirror and know you're a hypocrite. It's something else altogether for God himself to say, I know what you're like, and I know exactly what you're going to do once Moses is gone. You're not going to keep this covenant. You're not going to obey all these rules and instructions I'm giving you. You're not even going to stay loyal to me as your God. No, you are going to dump me, forget what I've told you, turn your back on me, and then go out pursuing other gods, because that's who you are. Not only that, God is so confident that the Israelites will break their promises and turn away from him that he gives Moses a song to teach them. Something poetic with a melody, something they'll be able to remember years from now. It's a song that begins by recounting the goodness and kindness of God and how he has shown love to the people of Israel. He found Israel in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. And then after that, the song talks about how Israel responded to all that love and care. Now, keep in mind that what this song is talking about hasn't happened yet. God just knows that this is what the Israelites are going to do. He's so confident that he tells Moses to sing about it beforehand. But Israel grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then Israel forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods. And so in response, the Lord turns against the people and brings judgment against them. All of that is in Moses' song that he sings to them on the banks of the Jordan River. It hasn't even happened yet, but God knows it will. And he tells Moses that when many evils and troubles have come upon them, this song shall confront them as a witness, for it will live unforgotten in the mouth of their offspring. Imagine that. Imagine you are an Israelite, and here, in one of the most important books of your scripture, you find not only remembrances of all your past national failures, but a song that forever memorializes the bad news of how fickle and faithless you really are. Thankfully, that's not the final message of Israel's gospel. These final chapters also contain good news. In our last session, I talked about those powerful verses in chapter 30, where Moses prophesies about how after Israel fails and is judged, how in the future God will once again redeem them and forgive them and renovate them from the inside out. But that isn't the only source of good news in these final chapters. It's curious that right after Moses sings that song in chapter 32, all about their idolatry and hypocrisy and immorality, it's interesting that the very next chapter contains a series of blessings that Moses pronounces over each one of the 12 tribes. It's curious because you might think after that tragic song and the prediction of Moses' death, you might think that there's nothing really hopeful left to say. But that doesn't stop Moses. He still blesses the people. And his blessings, they're not just well wishes or hopeful dreams. They're much more prophetic than that. So he blesses the people and he talks about how God will protect them from their enemies and provide for them and how they will flourish and rejoice. And then he ends his blessings with a celebration of God's faithfulness and love. And he says, "Happy are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph?" Of course, as you read this, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that all sounds well and good. But where is all this optimism coming from? Didn't you just say that Israel would turn against God and endure his judgment? How do you reconcile all of that gloom and doom with this hopeful attitude? Deuteronomy itself doesn't answer that question, at least not directly. Although there is a clue. It comes right at the end of the book, right in the last couple sentences of chapter 34. We don't know who wrote this chapter. Most of the book of Deuteronomy is written in the voice of Moses, but chapter 34 is an account of his death. So clearly it was added at some point after he died. And the language suggests that it's quite some time after Moses' death because the author is clearly looking back many years when he says, "And never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Never since has there arisen a prophet like Moses. That's very interesting, especially when you compare it to something Moses says much earlier in the book, in chapter 18. The Lord your God will raise up a prophet like me from among you, from among your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. The Lord said to me, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Just as Moses expects God to bless Israel and redeem them after their failures, he also expects God to raise up a prophet like him, who will be some kind of agent of redemption. And yet, whoever is writing at the end of the book says that no prophet like Moses has yet arisen. Which doesn't mean that God was lying back in chapter 18. It just means that the Israelites must still live by faith. No matter what circumstances they find themselves in, as they read the book of Deuteronomy and they hear both its bad news and its good news, they must look to the future and trust that God will somehow keep his promises. Because that's what it means to live by faith. It means to trust that God will actually do what he says he'll do. And in that sense, we as Christians aren't any different. Don't get me wrong, we do know more than ancient readers of Deuteronomy knew. We know, for instance, how God was able to bring judgment against sin while still bringing blessing to his people. And we know who that prophet like Moses is. In fact, the Apostle Peter identifies him directly. In Acts chapter 3, not long after Jesus' resurrection, Peter, he's speaking to a group of Jews in Jerusalem, and he's telling them that God raised Jesus from the dead, and he quotes that verse from Deuteronomy 18, the one about God raising up a prophet like Moses. And Peter identifies that prophet as Jesus, the one who God has literally raised from the dead. So we're in a different situation than those ancient Israelites. We know for certain how God kept some of those promises. Nevertheless, we too still have to live by faith. We too have to trust in promises God has made to us that haven't yet come true. And that's one of the wonderful things about the way Deuteronomy ends as a book. It teaches us something about what it means to live by faith. As the Jewish philosopher Jonathan Sacks observes, what an extraordinary way to end a book. Not just a book, but the book of books, with Moses seeing the promised land from Mount Nebo, tantalizingly near yet so far away that he knows he'll never reach it in his lifetime. This is an ending to defy all narrative expectations. A story about a journey should end at a journey's end, with arrival at the destination. But the Torah ends in the middle. It is constructed as an unfinished symphony. Sacks says that's intentional. Deuteronomy is a journey that ends before it's completed because it's telling us that we, the readers, are still on that journey. We too are still anticipating this future yet to come. I think that's a very fitting metaphor for this book, a journey, because it's the exact same metaphor that the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament uses to describe the life of faith. After talking about several Old Testament stories about people of faith, Hebrews says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. There is a kind of restlessness to faith, because faith demands that we believe this gospel, this good news, both the bad news and the good news. If the Israelites were going to trust the words of Deuteronomy, then that means they were going to have to accept all the tragic truths it tells about them. Likewise, if we're going to trust the words of Jesus, then that means we have to accept the hard things that he speaks to us. When he tells us that we're lost and sick, that we're hypocritical and self-serving and so frequently deceived. That's part of where the restlessness comes from. But the life of faith is also restless because it asks us to believe good news for which we have no absolute proof. And it asks us to hope in a future that's based on nothing more than promises. For Israel, that meant believing that God would still redeem them, despite all of their failure. For us, it means believing that God really has forgiven us and welcomed us, and that Jesus was really raised from the dead, and that no matter how bad things may get, and no matter how bleak our situation may seem, to live by faith means to live with hope, trusting that one day we will find that homeland we're looking for. One day we too will be raised. One day, as Julian of Norwich says, one day all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That was the gospel that Moses spoke to Israel. And that's the gospel that the book of Deuteronomy and the Bible as a whole continues to speak to us today.